Welcome to this video on GraphQL with the mean stack. We are going to use Node and Express to create a GraphQL CRUD API that persists data to a Mongo database with the help of Mongoose. And we will also connect the GraphQL API to an Angular frontend and perform the CRUD operations from the client. So we'll just create our folder structure, and I'll just make a new directory and I'll call it backend. And we can cd into the backend, and we can just create a node application by running npm init-y. And what this will do for us is it will create the package.json file, and we can go ahead and install our dependencies. So I'll run an npm install express GraphQL Mongoose body parser and cause. And I'll also install as a developer dependency with the -d flag nodemon. So in our package.json file, we can, in the scripts, we can create a start script using nodemon, and we can just say nodemon on the app.js file, which we will create. So in the back end, we can create a new file, app.js, and this is where we will create our server. So we can go ahead and import our dependencies that we need. So the first one we'll need is body parser, as we'll be expecting JSON data and we'll need to pass that on the body. So let's get that in. And the next one we'll need will be Express, of course. We'll need the framework for Node, lightweight Express framework. Then we'll need Mongoose from Mongoose, and we'll also need cause. So because we're going to have an Angular application on port 4200, and this is going to be served on port 3000, just a simple way to get past that, we can just add a cause middleware. And we will also need the GraphQL HTTP, which comes from requiring from express-GraphQL. So the first thing we want to do is we want to create our connection to Mongoose, to a Mongo database using Mongoose. And it should be noted that I'm using MongoDB Compass as my graphical user interface for the NoSQL database. So we'll have to firstly create our app, and that can be done just by instantiating Express, our application. And we want to just quickly add some middleware here so we can pass our responses of the JSON format, and we can also use cause to mitigate against cross-origin resource sharing errors that may otherwise occur. Of course, another middleware we'll need to implement is the GraphQL, and it's to be noted that there's only one endpoint, and it's a post request to /GraphQL for GraphQL API. So what this will be is it will be a middleware here where we have the endpoint /GraphQL, and from the imported GraphQL HTTP we can use that and it takes an object and it takes a schema, and we haven't defined this yet. It takes a root value and we need to define that as well. And there's also a user interface, graphical user interface called graphical, and we can actually make queries from there. So if you're familiar with Postman, where we can make API requests, there's a tool especially for GraphQL APIs in the browser. So we'll come back to the schema and the root value, which is a resolver. But first, what I'd like to do is I would like to connect to Mongo using Mongoose. So I'm just going to comment this out for now. But what we want is we want to have the name or username that you've created to get into your MongoDB Compass, along with the password and the database name. So I haven't actually created the database name, but we can create it on the fly. So for this, in our backend, I'm going to create a new folder called config, and in that file I'm going to create a file in that folder called config.json, and it's in this file here where I'm just going to create a few values here. So I'm going to have a username, and I'll put my username in here. I'll put my password in here, and this is likely to be generated you know, as some sort of hash value, and we can put our DB name here, and I'm just going to call this CRUD. So we can go ahead and save that, and we can close that config.json file. And with that config.json file, we can actually use that and import that, so we can use those without being directly using the password in plain sight. Even though it's all protected, it's just an extra layer of security there. So just after the GraphQL HTTP import, I'm going to import config, and that's going to be done by requiring it from the location which we've just put it into the config folder, into config.json here. So now I am able to create our Mongoose connection, and Mongoose actually has a .connect method, and this method, it can take it takes a string of, you know, the server, the username, the password, and all of that. So what we can type in here is we can just type in MongoDB plus srv : // and I've used the backtick so I can use these template literals, and we've imported the config file with the config.json configurations, and on that we have the username and the password. So we can just do get the config.user : and then we can get the config.password, and this is just going to be at the particular cluster that you have for your Mongoose. So I've got this cluster here, cluster 0 MVCMF, so I can go ahead and put that in. So cluster -0, cluster 0 dash MB CMF, and that's coming from mongodb.net. And then we can have / and this is where we're going to have our database name. So we can use this template literal with the configuration. So config dot the database name, and then we can just have a few query parameters here, I suppose. So we can have retry writes equal to true, and this is just the default from the Mongoose recommendations, and W equals majority. Now on later versions of Node, there's an extra parameter which is an object of properties that we need to define here, and namely what we'll need to include here is use unified topology, set that to true, use new URL parser, set that to true, and use create index and set that to true. So this actually returns a promise, so we can chain on a .then here, and what we can actually do here is we can just say app.listen, and we can specify the port number here, and we can also have this other parameter so we can just check that we are actually logging, we are connecting. So I'm just going to say connecting to port 3000, or I might change this to connected to port 3000, and then of course if we have any errors we can catch those, and for an error we can just also console.log and log the error. So we have our connection here, and let's just test that we actually can connect with our database. We don't have any methods or anything, but if we run an npm start here from the backend folder, we get connected to port 3000, which implies that we actually have connected to our Mongo database here. So I'm just going to do a Control C because I want to change quite a few things here. So okay, so now that we have our connection to the Mongo database from Express or our Node server, we want to use the GraphQL middleware from the GraphQL HTTP method that we imported. So that takes a schema, and I should spell it correctly, and it also takes a resolver. So the schema is similar to sort of like the model, and it's a GraphQL type sort of definition of the input for the queries or mutations that we're going to do. So a query is just like a regular query where you query a database, except in GraphQL terms the query refers to retrieving or getting information, and a mutation is modifying the data. So you know, if we edit it or delete the data in some way or create a new post or something like that, that's all considered mutations. So what I might do is I might actually create a GraphQL folder here to encapsulate that GraphQL in the back end here. So I'll create this GraphQL folder, and in this GraphQL folder I'm going to create our schema with a schema.js, and I'm also going to create our resolvers with a resolvers.js folder here, file here. And in addition to the GraphQL folder I've created, I might also create a models folder, and our application is just going to be a simple CRUD application where we can create a quote, and the quote will have, you know, the quote itself and an author. And so I'm going to model a quote. So in the models, I'm going to have this file here called quote.js. And I might actually do this first just so we have some shape of where we're heading towards. And we want to create a new database. So we have, well, we're creating a new database in our app. Well, we're connecting to the database name, and I just called that CRUD. It's not created yet, but Mongo allows us to do that on the fly if it's not already created. And in our database, we want a particular schema or a table from a relational database perspective. So we can go ahead and we can get Mongoose, and we can just go ahead and require that from Mongoose. So then we have access to the Mongoose properties. And with that, we can actually create a schema here. And I might just put a separation here. So our schema is from Mongoose, and there's a particular schema. So that means we can now create the shape of our schema or our table. And I'm going to have a quote schema. So I'm just going to call this quote schema. And I can create a new schema. And we can pass in an object of objects, essentially. Well, property object pairs. So the key, well, one of them that we can use, so we're going to have a quote and an author. So for a quote, we need to actually specify the type. So if I type in the type here, we know that that's going to be a string. And we'll also set it to be required. And I might just copy this down because an author is going to be quite similar. It's also going to be a string and required. I'll just change the word to author. And what we can do is we can just export that. So we're able to use it in our controllers or our resolvers, which is the GraphQL equivalent for the controllers. And if I just use this mongoose.model, what I can do here is I can create a quote database, and you know, this will come up as quotes in the database, but we specify it as a singular here. And then I can pass in the quote schema here. So with that model there, we sort of have the shape of our database and our schema or our table in particular. So we've got that, and I keep doing this typo where I write SCEM, so I might just quickly rename that, and that is here. So hopefully I haven't done that elsewhere. Schema. Okay, so in our schema, so this is Mongoose, and this is coming from Mongo, so we have, you know, types from there, from Mongoose, but then we have this GraphQL layer, and we need to actually interact with the GraphQL database, which is, you know, going through objects and stuff like that. So we actually need to do a similar thing for the schema. So we can just go ahead and we can get the build schema, and that's going to be from just GraphQL, and this is going to allow us to build a schema for GraphQL. And we can just do a module.exports here, and we can use that build schema that we've just imported, and I can just put some backticks here so we can actually create our schema. And it's to be noted that our GraphQL schema, it needs to have a query, or it needs to have a root query, and we're going to have query and mutations because we're going to have all the CRUD operations. So recall, queries for getting, and mutations are akin to you know, posting or putting or deleting from an API, a RESTful API perspective. So nevertheless, we can create our schema, and we'll initially just make it so we can get something. So we'll just have a query here, and we need some sort of root query. So I'm going to create that root query, and we can actually make that, and it's going to be a certain type, and this is where all of our queries or all of our GET requests are going to be. So in the root query, we're going to have a quotes query, and that's going to be of a particular type, and we're actually going to create some type, and we're going to have some quote data type. So I'm just going to call this quote data, and the exclamation mark signifies that it's actually required to be of that type. So okay, before I make the quote data, what I might do is I might just create our type here for the quote by itself, and it should be noted that when we create or we insert a new entry into our schema, so into our quotes schema, we will need Mongoose, it generates an ID for us, and by default it has this underscore here, so the ID to identify the document or the row, so it doesn't get confused with other rows, so we can pinpoint that one. So, and there's actually this ID type, so we can signify that that ID from Mongoose is of the ID type and is required. And we can also just have a quote here, which will just be our typical string, and an author, which will just be a string as we defined in the models for the quote. So with that, what we actually want to do is get all of our quotes, not just one quote. So we can go ahead and create that type there, and we can call that quote data, and you know, this could be anything really, but we're going to have quotes here, plural, and we can actually have an array, and we can have an array of quotes that are all required, and the array itself is required. So when we have this root query here for quotes, we can have an array of quotes, which, you know, each quote has an ID, a quote, and an author. So that's the beginnings of the schema, and now we can start to look at the resolvers, and for this we can actually import this quote schema here, because Mongoose gives us some nice methods such as finding or finding by ID and stuff like that we can just use, and we don't have to create those. So we can just go ahead and get that, and we'll get that model from requiring, and we can go back to the models, and we can get that quote model that we created. And what we can do here is we can just use this module.export syntax here, and this is where we can actually, this is sort of equivalent to the controllers, and they're called resolvers. So the schema defines the shape of the GraphQL query, and in particular we have a root query, and the query is just for getting. So we have this quotes here. This is related to the function that we need to create of that type. So we can create this quotes here, and this is going to be an asynchronous function because we're going to need to use the await keyword, and we can define it in the following way. And what we can do to handle this is we can say, okay, we can create a constant variable here, and we'll call it quotes, and we can await, and we can, on the quote, we can actually use this find method, and if we don't pass anything in from Mongoose, this will actually find everything from the quote, well, this quote schema, so the whole table. So one thing to note here is we're expecting the shape of our schema to be like this. So each row or entry will have an ID of underscore ID, and we'll have a quote and an author, and we're expecting an array of these to be returned to us from this find method. So to handle that, and when we get that data back in to the client, we need the type of it to be lined up correctly. So there's no ID type in JavaScript. There's strings and stuff like that. So we have to actually make that conversion. So we can pretty much just return that object that we have there. So we can return everything here. But for our quotes, so we just need to map through all the quotes that we have, and for each quote we just need to go through them. So I'll just have Q here for short, and what we actually need to return for each of those is, and we can use some destructuring, the spread operator here in combination. And for each document, we can actually get the entire document. So for each quote or each row in our table, we can get all of the properties on that with this q._doc. So we're going to get, for one iteration, we're going to get one ID, some sort of quote, some sort of author, but we're mapping through all of those. So we're going through each quote from the quotes array, because we found a multiple potentially, but we need the type to be consistent with what we're going to be using it with. So in particular, the ID, to get out of that ID type, we actually need to overwrite the ID property. So this gets the ID, the quote and author, and this won't append another ID. This sees that it's the same key here as this, so it will take that and it will override it. And we pretty much want the same thing here. So we want the ID for that particular quote, but we just want to make it a string just to ensure that the types are alright. So okay, so with that we can just go ahead and save that. And what we can start to do now is we can actually open up a new terminal, and with Angular I might just create a new project. I'm just going to call this ng-new. I'm just going to call it front end because I've got a backend folder here, so it seems appropriate. And it's going to be very simple, so I'm just going to say no, and we don't even really need CSS or Sass or anything like that. So this will go ahead and install for us here, and we'll just wait for that to load. So while that's loading in the back end, what I can do here is I can actually create, or I can link to those schemas and resolvers. So in our app we can link to those. So just here, just below this GraphQL HTTP import, we can have a GraphQL schema, and that's going to be by requiring that schema we just created. So from the GraphQL folder, there's the schema, and similarly we can get the resolver, and if we just backspace that we can get some intelligence for the resolver, or we call it resolvers, GraphQL resolver. So our schema, we can do this to do here. We can use the GraphQL schema, comma, and here we can use the GraphQL resolver. So if we take a look at our basic setup here, we have Express, we have Mongoose, we have body parser, and we have GraphQL HTTP. We connect to Mongoose, we connect to the the particular database that we're interested in, and we can bypass any CORS issues with this CORS method here. And for our Express application, we can pass any JSON body data, and in particular we have this schema and resolvers, and we also have this schema here defined for us by Mongoose, which defines the type of our database or our particular table in the database for the quotes table. And with that quotes table, we're going to interact with that quotes table, and we're going to interact with it on the front end. So we're setting up a GraphQL API on the back end so we can interact with it on the front end. So we need a layer there to interact with that GraphQL, and this is where we set up the types for our queries and mutations. So right now we just got a one query here, and that's just to get the quote data, and that's just going to be an array of quotes, so potentially multiple quote authors and IDs, and that's handled for us in our asynchronous function here, this quotes function. So let's see how we can actually sort of interact with that. And it should be noted that they're actually, so right now there's not going to be anything in our database, but if we did a npm start here, oh sorry, I need to go to the first terminal. If I do an npm start here, okay, we got an error. And for some reason I've typed this word GraphQL here. So let's save that. And okay, so we're connected to port 3000, which means this is run. But if we go to /GraphQL, it actually brings up this sort of GUI for us to do some of these. So there's not going to be any anything in here at the moment, but if we do this sort of query here, for the quotes, on the quotes, get the ID, quote, and author, we can execute that, and we're not really expecting anything back, but we do have this shape here where we have, the data is an array of quotes, and the quotes contains an array of quotes. So what we're going to build towards is, creating some quotes here. So a second thing we might like to create is the ability to create a quote. So I'll do that before I get into the front end, because we need some information there, so we need to create that information. So what we can do is we can go back to our schema, and so recall that getting is just a query, but to add on to that, we need to have a different type. So, we need this mutation in our schema, and we once again follow that similar format, and we can have a root mutation. So if I create this type here, root mutation, this is where I can sort of define our functions that are going to handle the creation process, or also the update and delete process. So we can have this create quote resolver here, and this will take in a quote input, and the quote input, so imagine we're on the front end now, we're just going to type in the quote and the author. We're not going to type in the ID, of course. So we'll actually create this quote input data type as well, and this is going to return a quote, and you know that's expected. So there's another type. So just here below the quote data, there's actually an input type because we're expecting this to be an input. So we can say, okay, for the quote input data, what we can do here is for a particular quote, we know this is going to be a string. And there's no commas here, by the way. And for an author, this will also be a string. So this is our schema for creating a quote. So now we need to handle that in our resolvers. So we called this create quote resolver. So we need to create a function here. And just where this one ends here, this is where I'm going to create quote. This is going to be an async function. Now it's going to take something in here. Now when we have an argument here, we take in all of the args. So in this case here, we're actually taking in an object. So because we've defined this quote input type as this quote input type here, this quote input type is all of this. So it's this object here, quote and author. So the arguments that we're expecting, we can actually use some destructuring here for that quote input, and that will allow us to you know, just save a few keystrokes by not having the prefix before it for the args. So what we can do is we can, for a quote, we can create a quote by making a constant variable quote, and this is where we can actually use our model. So we can use this model and we can pass in an object there, and you know what we need there is just what we have here, the author and the quote. So we can have the quote, and now we can pass in data from the front end or from the client, and we've used this sort of destructuring syntax. So we can just say quote input, and we can get the quote from there, and we can also get the author. So we can get the quote input by getting the quote author from the input. So that's the shape of it, that's the values there. We can create that quote and they'll go to the database, and if we save it. So let's do that, let's save it. And we've got an asynchronous function here, so we can just say with the created quote, we can go ahead and we can await something, and we can await that quote and save. So what we're doing is we're saving that quote to the database, and we need to wait for that to happen before we can continue on. And we might return some information to the user. So we can return that object there, and we can use spread operator here. So we get everything from the created quote, which is, you know, the ID, the author of the quote. So we can actually just use the mongoose way of doing that with this underscore doc to get all that. But once again, we need the ID to be in the string format. So we can say created quote dot underscore ID, and then we just need to make that to string. So with that, we're now in a position to actually connect to that, and I'll show you that before we get into the front end. So if I comment out this query here and I use this query here, now this isn't a query anymore, this is a mutation. So we just need to define it's a mutation here, and if we go to docs here, we can actually sort of see that and I'll need to refresh, but we can actually see that we have the different types here. So we can actually build up our queries by, you know, we can see, okay, we've got this mutation here, we've got this create quote here, it takes in this type here, this type is this, and we can just use the IntelliSense with control space to actually create this. So I've already done this, but you could just type in the word mutation and then you call that create quote, and we're expecting the quote input, which is an object of quote, and I'm just saying new quote, and I'm just going to say the author's Jono's, And you know, we can actually just return the quote here as well. We can fetch whatever data we like, and that's one of the key benefits of GraphQL. So if I go ahead and execute that, I actually do indeed get this new quote returned to us. And if I refresh in MongoDB Compass, we can see that this CRUD database has been created, and within this we have quotes, and within this we got our unique object ID, we got the quote, and we got the author. So that's awesome. So what we want to do is we want to connect this to our front end, and to do that we need to go into our front end. So okay, so let's just CD there. So we're over here, so let's CD over here. Let's do a quick ls, make sure we're here. So okay, I might just collapse this now and open the front end, and we will just open this package.json file from the front end, because, and I'll close the back end one. What we're going to need to do is we're going to need to install something. So what we need to install is, well, it's actually sort of embedded into Angular now, so we can actually just do ng add and Apollo / Angular, and this will be how we can sort of interface with our GraphQL API from the client. So we'll use Apollo here, and this just might take a second to load, but what it's going to do for us is it's going to, in this source folder here in our app, yeah, it's actually created this GraphQL module and it's added it to the app module. So we can take a look at that. So let's just take a look at this. It has a few things here. It's a module, and it's getting the Apollo module and the Apollo options. And then we're going to be doing, you know, HTTP requests. So it's got some stuff there, and an in-memory cache. So what we need to do is we need to add in the URI here, and the URI, that's just simply our port here. So we're using localhost and our port / GraphQL. So if we come back here, we can type in localhost 3000 GraphQL. So we're now able to connect to our GraphQL server that we just created in Node. And then, you know, there's some functionality here to create the Apollo client and link server, in-memory cache, and, you know, some providers here in the module. But this all comes built in, so that's all good. Now I'm going to do everything in the app component, so feel free to sort of restructure this into different modules and components and services and all this, but this is really just to demonstrate how to connect GraphQL from a Node GraphQL API to the Angular, and how to consume it. For a better sort of structure on the front end, I do have this login MVC styled project that I built, and that's with Node, Angular, and MySQL, and that actually has proper structure and everything like that. So I'm just going to, you know, do everything in here. So I'm going to have the app component, and I'm mainly going to be working with the HTML and the TypeScript files here. So I'm just going to keep this nice and basic. What I want to do is I want to have the ability to create a quote. So I'll just have a header here, or H2 here, and we want two inputs here of type text, and I'm just going to give this like a template variable so we can get access to that value. And then we also want to get some author information here. And once again, you could use reactive forms or have more sophisticated ways of doing this, but I just want to show off and highlight the GraphQL So I'm just going to use this template variables here, and I can make a button, and you know, this can have a click event, and if we click the button we can call a create function, and now that I have access to the input elements, I can get the values from those, and I can get the author as well, and I might just put some submit text in here. And underneath this is where we can have our quotes. So I'll just have a H1 here, and what I'll do is I'll just cycle through all of our quotes and then I'll list them out. So I'll have a UL here, I'll have an LI, there's going to be a for loop here, but I'm going to need to set up some TypeScript in order to be able to handle this. So, and at the end of the LI, so there's going to be some sort of text here, and I'll have another button, oops, I'll have a button here, and this will also have a click event, and this will just be a delete, and at the moment it won't take anything in here, but I'll need to create that. Actually, I might even comment that out just for now, and just have it like this, just so I don't have to make the method just yet. So I'll still need to create that on the server. But what we can do in our app component.ts is, okay, we can get on a init here, so we can implement on a init on the class, which means we'll need a ng on a init, so ng on a init method, and I'm also going to need a constructor because I need to inject a service here, so I'll just preempt that. Now what we can import here is from the Apollo Angular import that we've set up. We can get Apollo, and this is coming from the Apollo-Angular location, and we're also going to need something called a GraphQL tag, and this allows us to write our query. So we can just say GraphQL from GraphQL-tag, and we're going to be dealing with observables, so I'm just going to import an observable here from RxJS, of course, and I might just shift alt down that line because I'm going to get map from RxJS/operators, and I can actually start to get quotes. So we have one quote in our database, so let's start to get the quotes, and we can actually write this query here, and I'm just doing everything on this app component page, so you can structure it in a better way, but I will create this with uppercase as that's the convention here, and then I can use that GraphQL sort of tag, and I can use these backticks here, and this is where we can sort of write our query, and this is going to be very similar to how we have it written here. So you know, we got our 3 mutations for create, update, delete, but we just want to get something, so we can use this sort of style here, but it is going to be slightly different, but it's based on the same sort of thing there. So what we can do is we can go into our quotes, and we're nested in there where we have the ability to have our quotes, and we can get back our ID, our quote, and our author. So this is the query. Now to execute the query, we need to get something in here. And I mentioned it before, we need to inject Apollo. So what we can do is we can also create a variable here, and we call it quotes, and it's going to be an observable and it's going to be any here, and because we're going to make a API request to our GraphQL server, and because it's synchronous, we need to expect it to be of the type observable before it gets into the database, gets it, retrieves it for us, and gives it back to us. So that's quotes. And when this app component's created, this is where I'll set this quotes. So this quotes, this is going to be equal, and this is where we can use the injected service here, so Apollo. And what we can do here is we can actually just say watch query, because there's a particular query that we're looking for here, and that query is the one we just defined here. So all uppercase get quotes, and whenever there's any value changes on that, we can actually just go ahead and we can pipe this observable, and we can actually map it, and we can take the result, which can be of any type, and we can sort of, what we'll do, we'll console log it just so we can see it. So result, and there's data in the result, and there's quotes, and recall that it's nested twice here, so we need to go into it like this, and this is exactly what we're going to return. So we can return this, and if we do that, we can now go back into our HTML, and we can cycle through that with the async pipe. So we can just say ng4, and we can say let quote of quotes. So quotes is that variable we just defined here. We're expecting an observable, and we use this Apollo service here, so we can make the asynchronous request from this query here. And because we're expecting the value can change, and if it changes we can sort of watch for that, and we can map the result back to us. So that's why we need this async pipe on those quotes, and that should be a pipe. So now we have access to each quote. We can actually just go ahead and we can just, if we want here, we can just say for that quote, we can display the quote, and we can even put it in quotes, and we can also have the quote author as well, so whoever wrote that quote. So why don't I just go ahead and save that, and I'll do an npm start here, load up Angular, get Ivy compiling. So this is the first time, so I might just take a second here. And there is a minor error, and that's just because we haven't created this create function. So just below this ng on init, we can have this create function here, and this create function is going to take a quote, and it's coming from the input field, so it's definitely going to be a string, and likewise the author is going to be a string, and we want it to be a string anyway, so that's all good. And what we can do here is we can just console log quote author, save that. Now if we go back to our client and we open up localhost 4200, and we open Google's developer tools here, now you see that loaded there. It just had to take a second there to load. This quote here is coming from our Mongoose database, or Mongo database, using Mongoose. And what I want to do now that I've been able to fetch the quote, right now we're just logging this to the console here, but the idea is to get this and sort of append it to the list and update it in real time. So there's actually a nice way we can do that in our database, on the client here. And we've already created on the back end the ability to create the posts, and we've seen that in our GraphQL here with this mutation here. So I might just go ahead and comment that out. But we can use that to create something here. So, okay. So I might create another query. So just up here, up the top here, I'm going to have this create quote query. And I can use GraphQL. And my query, you know, we do this nested object thing here. Oh, no. We need to first define that we're dealing with a mutation. So this is different to a query. So we need a mutation, and I'm just going to call this create quote, the same name as what the actual method is. Now, one thing that we need to do here is we need to get the values, and they're going to be a variable. They're coming from the client, and to specify variables we can just use this $sign here. So there's going to be a $sign here for quote, and this is of the type string, and this is the string from defined in GraphQL, so capital S exclamation mark, we need it, and we need the author as well. So we can have a $sign author here for the string. Now we have this sort of outer layer. We can pass in the variables for that create quote mutation that we're after here. And recall that in our schema we have this mutation where it's the quote input, which is of an object quote and author. So if we head back over here for our quote input, we can actually just get that object's data in there like that. So for the quote, and this is where we can pass in our variable here for quote, just like that. And we do the same thing for author by getting that variable for author. And what we can return here is whatever we like. That's the good thing, we can fetch what we like, but we can, let's just get everything, may as well just get everything here. And this is sort of what's really good about GraphQL is when you're not sure what your client's going to be doing, or there's going to be lots of changes, as long as we supply that data, we can sort of show different data in different situations. So we might have a component that only shows the quote, and then another one where we want the quote and author, and we can fetch that however we like. But with that create quote mutation, we can actually sort of extend the create function that we have here. And what I can do is, rather than log this, I can just say this dot Apollo, use that service, because on that service there's a mutate method, and that mutate method takes in an object, and the particular mutation we're after is that create quote mutation. Now we need to pass in some variables here, and the variables we need to pass in, well, we're inside this create function here, so we have access to this quote and the author. So we can, you know, for the quote we can just use that quote input, and for the author we can use the author input, of course. Now what is going to happen is, if we imagine our page loads up and we have this quote here, but then we add something, we want it to appear to the list. So rather than reload the page, we can actually have this other parameter here in our mutation, in our mutate method, and this is just simply called refetch queries. And this just takes, you know, whatever queries we want to refetch. So we can list it out in an array, and this array contains this object here, query, and this will, we want to refetch the queries get quotes. So we want to get the quotes again, and because we have this constantly watched query where the value changes are being pipe asynchronous into the HTML, that means it's going to refetch that. So when the data, something's created, it's going to update that for us there, and then we can just have a comma there like that. Now, of course, like all of these, we're going to have to subscribe to this. So we can just go ahead and subscribe to this observable here. And this isn't really necessarily, but I'm just going to log this to the console just so I can confirm that something's being created here. So with that, now if I have a quote here, and let's just say latest quote, and this is going to be from Mike, submit that through, we get this created here. We also get the refetching of that. It shows up in our HTML here on the client in real time, and if we refresh our database for our schema for quotes, we get, we get another unique ID here, and we get the corresponding information, so quote and author. So this is sort of the beginnings of the GraphQL. I might just also make a update on the server and delete, so we can just finish this off. But we've essentially made it to a nice milestone. We've done both the query and the mutation. So this can be refactored however we like, but that's the core functionality out of the way. So let's just finish off this example here. We can go back to our schema, and we can make another mutation here. We can say update quote, and we need an ID for this, and this is going to be of the ID type in addition to the quote input. So when we create it, we don't need the ID, but when we update it, we do need the ID. So we can get that quote input, and that's going to be of the same type, so we don't have to recreate that quote input data. And that, of course, is going to return a quote, or it can return whatever we like, but we want to make it return a quote, the updated quote, of course. So if I go to our resolvers, what we can do, well, we can save this first, but we can create this update quote. So I'll do that, and once again, that's going to be an asynchronous function here, and it's going to take some destructured arguments, so I can just get the ID itself and the quote input, and we can just have this new quote. Well, first we need to find the quote to see if the ID can be found for that. So we can just say the ID we're looking for, the quote we're looking for, we can just await, and on the quote we can use this mongoose method here, find by ID, and we can just pass in that ID there, and we can have this if check. So if there's no quote, what we can do is we can just throw an error, and we can just say no quote found. However, it's expected, that it will work because we're setting it up to work. So we can actually, on that particular row we found, so let's say we get this one here, for this entry here, we passed in this ID, and then we want the value of the quote and the author, and we want to set it to the new input data of the new input and quote. So on that quote that we got, which contains everything there, we want to set the quote, and we want to set that equal to whatever we typed into the input field, and we got that. So we can get that from quote input in the same way that we did it on the create input. And I'll just shift alt down this so I can change the word quote here to author, because the quote or author both could have changed. in this, you know, made up situation here. So what we want to do is actually we want to save that. So we got the new input for the quote and the new author, and that's done by finding the ID and changing those values. We just need to save that. So we can save the updated quote, and because we've got an asynchronous function, we can await for that database operation to happen. So we can save that, and after that's done, we can return to the users, and this is where we can use destructuring with the spread operator to get everything from the updated quote, and we can do that by using _doc, but then once again we need to convert the ID type to a string. So that's the update, and I may as well just do the delete as well, but I'll just check that. I'll check it. So if I just undo this commenting here, now I have this particular ID here, so I'll just cancel that. Now I got latest quote and author is Mike. Now if I type in this ID here, and I can say, I might just put this quote to QWERTY, and the author is Harry. Now if I execute this, and it's just showing up here. Hold on, let me refresh this, then execute. Created quote is not defined. Okay, or created. Okay, I think I might have forgot to rename something here, and I can close this now, and this as well. Yes, so this created quote I just copied before should be update quote or updated quote. Okay, so let me just refresh that once again, and if I do a control enter here, yes, now we get back our quote. Look in the database, refresh it, and we get the quote for that corresponding ID, and the author changed to QWERTY and Harry respectively. Great. Now there's only one more operation to define in our schema here, and that's the delete operation, and we don't need any input data to delete it, so all we need here is the ID of the type ID, and this will be of the quote type. So I can save that. Now if I go to my resolvers here, I can make a delete quote function, or delete quote resolver, and I'll just get some of these brackets going. It's going to be an asynchronous function. It's going to be called delete quote, and what we'll do is we'll delete the quote, but we just need to check that the ID exists, so we'll just try find the quote first, and we can await quote, and Mongoose gives us find by ID, and we can just get that ID, and we can just check if there's no quote. I can just have that same error there. Now there's another method, and we don't need to assign it to a variable because we don't need to do anything with it, but we can just say find by ID and remove for the ID because we know it exists and we want to remove it, and we can just return something here, and what we'll do is we'll just do a similar thing as before. We can just return the doc or the document that we're deleting, just in case we need anything there on the front end. And once again, we can just say the ID needs to be a string type. So let's just convert that like that, and of course have a comma here, and that should finish up our GraphQL API here. So all we need to do is just go into our front end and add the ability to delete something. So let's just add this ability here like that. So we got this delete function here. Now for the quote, there's an ID associated with that, so we can just access that with the underscore ID on that particular quote. And I'll put the word delete in here. And if we go to our app component TypeScript file, this is where we can create our functionality here. So I'll just create this delete constant. So delete quote. We can use the GraphQL tag, and it's going to be a mutation. It's going to be mutation. We'll call it delete quote. It's going to take in a variable for the ID of the type ID with GraphQL. We have this delete quote mutation that we need to pass that variable into, which takes the ID, and then we can pass that variable into it. And once again, we can get back our ID, quote, and author. So all we really need to do now is just create the delete method, and then we're done. And you could imagine that we can just create it by having an ID, and in JavaScript it's going to be, or TypeScript, it's just going to be a string type because it's been converted. Now if you want, you could just console log the ID as well. But what I really want to do is I want to use the Apollo client service and use the mutate method, which takes an object, and it's going to look similar to this here. So I might just copy this in here. But of course, this is going to be delete quote in uppercase characters. Now we can also refetch the query. So if we delete something from it, we don't want it to still show or linger around when it's actually deleted. And the variables, we only have one variable here that we're passing in, and that's the ID. So that ID, you have the ID because you've got the ID from all the quotes when you fetch them. That corresponding ID, when you click on it, is passing to this delete method. This delete method takes that ID, and then it puts it into this delete quote GraphQL tag query. And because it has a variable, it has this variable syntax, it takes the ID as a variable, and that's this variable here, and that's how we pass it in, just with these variables here. So all we need to do is we can just say, we can just copy this subscribe here, subscribe to that event, and we can just say console log deleted, just to have confirmation that it's been executed. So what we can do, so let's check everything works. Go to our front end, we refresh, we can create a quote. I am great by John. Submit that. It loads here. Let's say I want to delete this quote, new quote. I can delete that. Okay, we do have an error here, so let's just fix that. Alright. So I copied the shape up above, but I don't think I need this, so let's just check that. I'll save that. And we did get the right ID here. So let's just reload this. And we can see if it works, so I can delete this. Okay, it doesn't work. Now I did call this delete instead of delete quote, so let's just get that going. So delete quote, And okay, so that's now named correctly. So this should work. It's connecting to the database. It connects. I can delete this. It deletes. It shows us it. It updates in real time. And I can also submit something here. And if we check our Mongo database, we refresh it, we see that we get the new and updated entries. So thanks so much for watching this mean stack GraphQL API. I hope it helped, and please subscribe to my YouTube channel for more videos related to JavaScript, full stack JavaScript, and web development in general. Okay, cheers.